Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 17 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Washington Capitals, in which the Sharks have lost 4-0. If you want to be an optimist, there is some good news to take out of this game. It's that compared to some of the previous games that the Sharks have played this season, just a couple of days ago against the St. Louis Blues, or a few more days ago against the Avalanche, this was not a game in which the Sharks were completely dominated. This was not a game in which the Sharks were thoroughly outplayed. They didn't look completely outmatched by the Washington Capitals in this one. It was a relatively close checking and close scoring game where the Capitals just got a couple of extra bounces. The Sharks couldn't really bury any of their chances, and so they ended up losing. That's the way of looking at it if you're really trying to find the bright side of this situation. If you're a bit more of a realist, you might be looking at a lot more bad news from this game. The first one being is just the situation both of these teams came into this game with. The Sharks, at the end of a 5-game road trip, they come back home for this game here tonight, back at home in San Jose. Meanwhile, the Capitals are on the final game of their California road trip, so you would think the Capitals would be the tired team and the Sharks would be the ready to go team at home on home ice, but instead it looked like both teams were somewhat sluggish, which is not something the Sharks wanted to kind of be dragged down to the level of the Capitals. On the other hand, the Sharks, while they played a decently even game with the Capitals, they didn't necessarily get a ton of shots on net, just 22 shots on goal for tonight's game, which has really been a consistent issue for the San Jose Sharks this season. They currently sit in the bottom 5 in terms of shots on goal per game, and with how chancy and at times random that NHL hockey can be, this is not really a consistent way of winning, because yes, there are going to be games where you get 25 shots, but you get a couple nice bounces going your way and you manage to win those games. We've seen that happen at times this season for the San Jose Sharks, but there will absolutely equally be games like here tonight where you only get 20-25 shots on net, you don't get those couple of bounces, and you end up getting shut out. The Sharks just have not been scoring a lot of goals over the past few games, which is a real big problem for this team, especially when you consider the injury to Jonathan Dahlen that occurred in this one. In the first period, he seemed to have some sort of, not really much of a collision, but I guess some sort of interaction with Capitals defenseman John Carlson, where he ends up skating towards the bench and into the dressing room holding his shoulder. Now, in the end, while he was called questionable to return, he would end up coming out for a couple of shifts at the beginning of the second period, which obviously left a lot of Sharks fans with a lot of hope. But in the end, he would end up going back to the dressing room, and it would be announced that he would not return, not even back to the questionable to return. He would not return for the rest of the game, and that ended up holding true. So again, if we want to be the optimist style, we could say, oh, maybe he just dislocated his shoulder, then they popped it back in during the intermission. He came back out for the start of the second, felt a bit uncomfortable, and so it was better that he would sit out the game. But if you want to be sort of more of a pessimist, you might be looking at this something, oh, maybe this is actually a lot more serious than the Sharks first thought, and he could be out somewhat long term, which would obviously be a very difficult situation for the San Jose Sharks. They came into this season hoping to introduce into the roster some younger talent, and when you take a look on the defensive side of things, this is the same exact core, or pretty much the same exact core, swapping Middleton with Knyzhov, which is actually not really much of an upgrade at all, if not a downgrade. And when you look at the forward side with Eklund back in Sweden and Dahlen potentially injured long term, the forward group isn't either looking particularly different from what the Sharks ended last season with. So how much progress forward can the Sharks actually make in a situation like this? So not a lot of great things to take out of this game, but I guess, as I said, the bit of good news is that the Sharks weren't completely destroyed here. In the first period, it started off with a Connor Sherry goal just in the first couple of minutes. Then it would be the classic Alex Ovechkin power play goal to put the Sharks in a 2-goal hole early in this game at the 20-minute mark. In the second period, the Sharks actually looked pretty good. We got the majority of the chances in that middle frame, but just not really getting any second and third opportunities. There were rebounds available that were given up by Ilya Samsonov, the goaltender for the Capitals, but none of the Sharks could really get their stick on that. There were actually like 2 attempts for a player like Nick Bonino to score in this game, but just can't buy a goal in this situation, and so the Sharks were still trailing for 2-0 after 40 minutes. Come into the third period, the Sharks kind of fell off their game, not generating a ton in that third period. Eventually, Sherry would score to make it 3-0, and Ovechkin would get his second of the game to make it 4-0 on the empty net, and that would be the game. For the first line, kind of hard to say how they ended up looking, as, like I said, Dahlin got injured in tonight's game, so it was Meier and Couture who eventually ended up with Rudolfs Balcers on that first line. Those three players didn't particularly look great together, didn't necessarily work all that well, so this was, you could say, one of the weaker lines for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. On the other hand, the Sharks' second line was really the major bright spot of tonight's game, and in particular was the Sharks call-up Noah Gregor. Gregor played a pretty substantial amount of games last season, but he ended up losing out in training camp to a couple of the younger Sharks forwards, like a player like Eklund and Dahlin, and so he started the year at the AHL, but he's been doing absolutely fantastic with the Barracuda, and he earned himself not only a call-up into the lineup here tonight, especially with the suspension to Kevin Labanc from that St. Louis Blues game, but he also earned himself a spot in the top 6 for tonight's game, and he absolutely showed that he deserved that spot in the top 6 here tonight. Whether or not this is a long-term plan for the San Jose Sharks, I would probably say it isn't, just based on Noah Gregor's past performances in previous games over the past couple of years, but it definitely worked here tonight. I would say he was absolutely the Sharks' best player here tonight. He just looked extremely engaged, especially when you compare it to a couple of the other Sharks players who kind of just floated around here in tonight's game, so that was definitely nice to see. Even with Labanc returning to the lineup for the next game, I suspect and I hope that Gregor will still find himself in the top 6, and when you consider that Dahlin could be out long term, there definitely is a spot open for him there. When it comes to the other two players on his line, Hertl and Barabanov, both of these players also looked quite solid. Hertl had a very nice solo effort, went through about 3 Capitals players before then hitting it off the post on the backhand, so he came very close to scoring a probably one of the goal of the year type of candidates, a very McDavid-esque style of goal, but it didn't end up coming to be. And Barabanov also still doing his usual crafty self in the offensive zone. Unfortunately, this line did not actually manage to score a goal, but they came rather close. The third line looked okay. Like I said, Bonino had a couple of good chances to score in this game. Cogliano also looking pretty decent. Balcers would eventually get moved off of this line, and Matt Nieto would come back to reunite the third line that had played the past couple of games together. Not a ton to really say about these three players besides the fact that, my God, are they snake bitten. And then finally on the fourth line, honestly, these players did not really stand out in any particular way. You could have told me that a player like Jasper Weatherby didn't even play in tonight's game, and I would almost believe you in a case like that, so that just goes to show that this fourth line didn't really do anything. On to the defensive side, the main thing that I do want to talk about in this situation is actually on the third pairing. We saw Hataka end up going back onto the 7th defenseman, back as a healthy scratch, and Shemek would step back into his role as the 6th defenseman on this team, and Shemek actually responded quite well to that benching. He looked rather re-energized in tonight's game, and sort of by association, Vlasic also looked quite good. So considering Hataka did not really have that great of a game with Vlasic in the previous one against the St. Louis Blues, it was really no surprise he would end up getting drawn out of the lineup. But Shemek definitely played quite well here tonight, and also earned a spot to likely continue with Vlasic as a pairing, at the very least for the foreseeable future. We'll see if Hataka ends up stepping in again at some point if one of these two players falter. I feel like that's exactly what Bob Boone is trying to aim for, but right now Shemek has certainly done enough. When it comes to the other 4 defensemen here, the fact is that the Capitals honestly weren't necessarily super oppressive in tonight's game. They didn't necessarily do a ton, and so when it comes to Burns, Ferraro, Carlson, Middleton, these guys weren't heavily pressured. They didn't make many misplays, but they also didn't necessarily stand out in a super amazing way. And so the fact is that these guys were, I guess, decidedly average throughout most of tonight's game. And then finally, we get to the goaltender, Adin Hill. And it's unfortunate that I have said this multiple times about Adin Hill thus far this season, but this was definitely a very Martin Jones style of game from Adin Hill. Because if you watch the highlights of most of this game, you would look at that Ovechkin goal and say, oh, well, that's Ovechkin from his office, a very difficult shot to save. And you look at that second Connor Sherry goal and you say, this is in close and kind of maybe a bit of a lucky bounce for Sherry, so not necessarily a terrible goal to let in. And then you look at some of the saves he made and you say, wow, Adin Hill made a couple of solid saves and even a couple of really good ones here tonight. But then you take a look at this first goal that he let in to Connor Sherry, and this is a classic Jones goal, not only because it was a bad one that he absolutely should have been able to make the save on, but also because it was in the first few minutes of a period, and specifically the first period. That was such a trademark of Martin Jones, where he would give up an early goal and sometimes an early bad goal, and it would just kind of demoralize the whole Sharks roster. So I honestly, if you told me that the Sharks roster all came down with some sort of PTSD because that Adin Hill let in this goal and they started remembering flashbacks of Martin Jones doing that very same thing so many times, I would honestly kind of believe you in a situation like that, because it is definitely demoralizing when you've already been dealing with that so many times over the past couple of years to then come into a completely new season. You're thinking Adin Hill's going to really give you a chance to win in a lot of games, but early on, the small sample size through his first few games of this season have not looked particularly promising. And then you come into tonight's game and he gives up a goal like this to Connor Sherry just about 2 or 3 minutes in. It doesn't necessarily make you want to go out immediately onto your next shift and try and score a goal. It kind of makes you just want to pack it in. Now, obviously, you're an NHL player. You got to keep it professional. And I'm not saying all of these players decided to pack it in for tonight's game, but you have to imagine playing in front of that is not super inspiring. And so not a great game from Hill, not a good game at all. I have to dock a lot of points from him because of that first goal let in. Maybe if he makes that save, we're looking at a completely different performance from the Sharks here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will take on the Carolina Hurricanes. If the Sharks thought the Washington Capitals were a difficult opponent to deal with, this Capitals team was only second place in the Metropolitan Division. The Carolina Hurricanes, their upcoming opponent, is actually first place in that division with a 14-2 record. So the Hurricanes are definitely going to be a very difficult opponent for the Sharks to deal with, and considering the potential long-term injury of Jonathan Dahlen, and just the general offensive situation for the San Jose Sharks, that's going to be a difficult one that could get potentially rather ugly. Class dismissed.